Bones tardes. És un plaer introduir una entrevista que vàrem fer en el Noam Chomsky el 13 de maig del 2008. L'UPEC, que com bé sabeu és la Universitat Progressista d'Estiu de Catalunya, té com part de la seva vocació el crear un intercanvi entre persones d'esquerra progressistes de Catalunya, d'Espanya, d'Europa i del món. I per nosaltres era de molt interès saber què pensava Noam Chomsky sobre el que està passant aquests dies als Estats Units, Europa i el món. Noam Chomsky és una persona d'una enorme importància i quan s'escrigui la història intel·lectual del segle XX i XXI, Noam Chomsky tindrà un capítol molt important. Ha sigut la veu més crítica dintre dels Estats Units en quant no sols la política exterior d'aquell país, però també en quant a l'estructura de poder dels Estats Units. En aquest moment, els Estats Units està a la primera pàgina de totes les notícies. I, com sempre, els mitjans de comunicació controlen, canalitzen, manipulen, i és difícil saber què passa en un país tan complex com és els Estats Units. Aquesta complexitat dels Estats Units encara està més accentuada degut a l'enorme diferència de cultures polítiques entre aquell país i les cultures d'Europa, d'Espanya i Catalunya. D'aquí que es va decidir per part de l'equip directiu de l'UPEC d'invitar-lo per donar la lectura inaugural, la classe inaugural de les jornades d'aquest any. Ell no va poder vindre perquè la seva esposa està molt malalta, es va excusar. Ell coneix Catalunya. És més, té una gran simpatia i lligam emotiu en Catalunya perquè com a intel·lectual dels Estats Units va seguir molt de prop aquella guerra civil. Ens explicava que com jove ja es va sentir molt identificat en la causa republicana en contra del feixisme. Ara bé, l'entrevista no és sobre el passat, és sobre el present i sobre el futur. L'entrevista se centra sobre els Estats Units, què està passant als Estats Units, què és el fenomen Obama. És una promesa de canvi o és una construcció mediàtica? També volien saber la seva opinió sobre el que passa en Europa. I veureu que parla, i a vegades molt críticament d'Europa. I també volien saber la seva opinió sobre el món. Ell ha estat molt involucrat, és un dels punts de referència pel món antiglobalització i té també coses molt interessants a dir sobre el futur d'aquest moviment. Aleshores, aquestes 45 minuts d'entrevista i que jo he tingut el plaer de fer-la. Jo conec en Noam Chomsky per molts anys. En realitat som amics, molt amics. I des d'aquest punt de vista, ell va acceptar en unes condicions molt difícils, en una situació familiar, perquè estava disposat a través meu poder contactar aquest món de Catalunya i Espanya. Des d'aquest punt de vista, el Noam Chomsky és una persona super interessant, no sols com a intel·lectual, però també com ser humà. És d'aquestes persones úniques que, a pesar del seu gran renom, és un home molt senzill, molt accessible i molt agradable. Anem passar unes hores molt agradables amb ell, fent l'entrevista després d'una manera informal. I, naturalment, es va comprometre que vindria i no renunciem a tindre'l entre nosaltres un any fent la conferència inaugural. Els temes que toca són temes que són rellevants per a nosaltres i d'enorme importància. A vegades serà difícil d'entendre perquè són termes i una narrativa diferent de la nostra. I al final jo faré algunes observacions en quant a mostrar la rellevància del que Noam Chomsky ha dit pel nostre país, que són molt pertinents perquè el que passa als Estats Units, en certa manera, és el futur nostre en el cas que no canviem. I el futur l'hem vist i a vegades no funciona. És des d'aquest punt de vista que d'una manera relaxada parlem. Ell em coneix a mi, coneix els meus treballs, els cita inclús en aquesta entrevista, però també en els seus. I, per exemple, fa referència la situació sanitària, que és molt preocupant, en el que a vegades no es capta que no hi ha un sistema que garantitzi l'accés als serveis sanitaris als Estats Units. En realitat, 100.000 persones moren l'any degut a la manca de serveis d'atenció sanitària. Aquest és un problema molt greu. Ell fa referència a aquest tema, fa referència a altres en els quals jo també he estat escrivint i treballant, i ell fa referència a això. Hi ha una amistat, hi ha una estima, hi ha una admiració mútua i que es reflexa en aquesta entrevista. Aleshores, ja sense més, introdueixo aquesta entrevista en el Noam Chomsky, que crec que tots coincidim és un dels intel·lectuals més importants dels temps que vivim. Well, Noam, thank you so much for welcoming us here.
Delighted to have a chance to talk to you.
Thanks. We're here as on behalf of the some Progressive University of Catalonia, as I mentioned to you, is intent of recovering the history of Catalonia, when workers and academics got together during the summer to be able to discuss things of the day. That was, of course, forbidden during the dictatorship. And then when in 2003, the left-wing parties recovered government, they renew again this commitment. And that we wanted to have you there. You couldn't make it, but we still hope that you will be able to make it someday.
Hope so.
Good. I wanted to chat about you and also about the United States, because you are indeed the best-known intellectual abroad. And sometimes people outside the United States are not fully aware of what it means that the best-known intellectual of the United States abroad does not appear very frequently in the major media. So when we watch the TV, CBS, NBC, and the major channels, you are not there. And that many people do not realize that, because the United States is frequently idolized as extremely dynamic, active democracy, and they not fully realize how discriminated the left is within the United States. How do you respond to that? How do you explain that?
Well, I should say the place where I am most feared and despised is probably left liberal intellectual circles. Actually, if you want to see a graphic indication of this, you can take a photograph of one of my favorite journal covers, which is framed and posted right outside the door. It's the journal of, it's more or less the official journal of left liberal intellectuals, American Prospect. And the cover depicts the terrible circumstances in which they try to survive and the enormous forces that are virtually destroying them. If you look at the picture, there are two figures depicted, two faces, sneering, angry. On one side is Dick Cheney and the Pentagon. On the other side is me. You know, they're caught between these two huge forces. You know. That's indicative of the paranoia and the concern that there might be some small break in orthodoxy. The liberal intellectuals typically are it's not just in the United States, the kind of guardians at the gates. You can go this far, but not 1 millimeter farther. And it's terrifying to think that somebody might go a millimeter farther. And that extends over the major media too. So yes, it's a very free country. In fact, it's the freest country in the world. I don't think freedom of speech, for example, is protected anywhere in the world as much as it is here. But it's a very managed society. It's a business-run society, carefully managed, strict doctrinal requirements, no deviation from them, tolerated. It's too dangerous. One of the reasons it's too dangerous is that the political establishment, both political parties, the political class, on many major issues, they're well to the right of the population. Healthcare, for example, which you've written about for decades. The population is to the left of the establishment has been forever. And the same is true on many other issues. So permitting issues to be discussed is threatening, and permitting a deviation from kind of a party line is dangerous, has to be carefully controlled. So yes, a very free country, at the same time, very rigid ideology.
Yeah, but it's surprising because from outside, the impression that many of our European colleagues in academia see United States as a very sort of a stable political system. And in that respect, there was one thing that with such a powerful dominant class, one of the things they could afford, so having more freedom and having more critical voices in the media.
Well, God, ask your...
It's like they would be afraid of.
I think they are afraid. There's terrible fear. That photograph indicates it. And the fear is slight deviation may lead to disaster. It's a typical totalitarian mentality. You have to control everything. If anything is out of control, it's a disaster. And in fact, the stability of the society is not so obvious. So for example, if you, and that requires a lot of suppression. So take, say, the Pentagon Papers are quite interesting in this respect. The Pentagon Papers are not declassified documents. It's like stealing conquering a country and stealing its archives. You know, it wasn't intended for the public. And there are a few interesting things in it which are suppressed. The most interesting is what is the account at the very end of the Pentagon Papers. The period they cover ends in mid-1968, right after the Tet Offensive in January 1968, which convinced the business classes that the war's too costly, it's not worth pursuing. But those next few months, there was an attempt by the government to send an extra 200,000 troops to Vietnam, which would have raised it to practically 750,000. And there was a debate, and it's discussed there, and they decided not to do it. And the reason is that they feared that if they did, they would need the troops for civil disorder control in the United States, because there would be an uprising of unprecedented proportions among young people, women, minorities, the poor, and so on. They barely had it under control, and any move might have led to an uprising. Yeah. And it continues. You just cannot let the population out of control. They have to be tightly disciplined. One of the reasons for the extraordinary pressure of consumerism, this goes back to the 1920s, is the recognition by the business world that unless they atomize people, unless they drive them to what they called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, the population may turn on them. I mean, right now, for example, about 80% of the population believes that the country, in their words, is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, not for the benefit of the population. About 95% of the population thinks the government ought to pay attention to public opinion. The degree of alienation from institutions is enormous. But as long as people are atomized, worried about maxing out their credit cards, separated from one another, don't hear serious critical discussion, well, the idea is they can be controlled.
Sure. No, another thing that happens is also an idealization of the American system now with the primaries, that they have been shown as a sign of vitality of this democracy. And here you have or the Obama phenomena that in some way the masses are mobilized and putting him forward. That is so contrary to that reality, but how do you explain this idealization of the American political scene that is so common in Europe?
The people who have the illusions, you have to ask what's the source of their illusions, but it's clear what's happening. And the establishment understands it very well. So for example, there's one day, it's called Super Tuesday, February 5th, there's like a couple of dozen primaries, so big excitement. Take a look at the Wall Street Journal. It's a front page story on Super Tuesday, big headline over the front page is issues recede in 2008 election, voters prefer character. Well, issues didn't actually recede because they were never there. They're carefully kept out of sight by the party managers. But it's true that they're in the background. And it's not that voters prefer character. Voters would be perfectly happy to vote for the national health care system that they wanted for decades. It's just that those things aren't options. The party managers, or basically the public relations industry that sells commodities on television, they market candidates the same way they market commodities. You see an ad on television, you don't expect to learn anything from it. If we had a free market, General Motors would post on television the characteristics of the cars they're selling. They don't do that. And what they do is try to create illusions, complicated graphics, a famous actress driving up to heaven or something like that. The point is to delude and marginalize the public. When you market candidates, it's the same thing. You want to keep away from issues. Too dangerous. The public doesn't agree with you on issues. So what you have is character, trivialities, personal issues. Did his pastor say something? Did Clinton make a mistake when she talked about Bosnia? Anything but the issues. So the population just didn't know what the issues are. And this is popular opinion in the United States is very well studied, mainly because the business classes who run the country want to have their finger on the public pulse. If you're going to control and propagandize, if you're going to control people's attitudes and opinions, you have to know a lot about them. So we know a lot about public opinion. And say in the last election, 2004, I think about 10% of Bush voters even knew his positions on anything. Not because they're stupid or uninterested, but because the elections are a marketing system. It's a business-run society. You market commodities, you market candidates. The public are the victims, and they know it. That's why 80% think, more or less accurately, that the country is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves. So they're not deluded, they just don't really see any choices. Now the Obama phenomenon is an interesting reaction to this. Obama's handlers, the campaign managers, have created an image which is essentially a blank slate. The Obama campaign is, the words are hope, change, unity, kind of totally vacuous slogans, said by a nice person, looks good, talks nice. And you can write anything you like on that blank slate. And a lot of people are writing on it their hopes for progressive change. No basis for it in the campaign. As the Wall Street Journal correctly said, issues recede. It's character that's up front. But yes, it is a popular phenomenon, and I think it reflects the alienation of the population from the institutions. They're grasping at a straw. Here's a possibility that maybe somebody will stand up for what we want, even though he's not saying so. Looks like the kind of person who might do it. Actually, it's quite interesting to look at the comparisons that are made. He's compared to Kennedy and to Reagan. I mean, Kennedy and Reagan were media constructions. Reagan particularly. He probably didn't even know what the policies were, but he was a creation of the media, who wasn't particularly popular, incidentally, but they created the image of this wonderful cowboy who saves us, and so on and so forth. The Kennedy administration, they were more in control, but they understood. They were the first ruling group to understand the power of television. And they created a kind of charisma through good public relations. So an image of Camelot, this marvelous place, wonderful things happening, the great president. You look at the actual actions, it was grotesque. He's the president who invaded South Vietnam. He launched a major terrorist war against Cuba. Go on and on. He was responsible for his administration was responsible for the establishment of the Brazilian neo-Nazi dictatorship. Coup took place right after the assassination, but the ground was prepared by the Kennedys. That led a horrible plague of repression over Latin America, and on and on. But the image is there. And imagery is very important when you're trying to control a dissident population. Actually, it's not a fascist country. That's a bad analogy. But the similarity to fascist propaganda techniques is quite striking. And it's not accidental. The Nazis explicitly, consciously, openly took over the techniques of American commercial advertising and said so. They, fuse a few simple ideas, stress them over and over, make them look glamorous. That was American commercial advertising in the 1920s. And it was the model that the Nazis explicitly adopted. And it's the model of business propaganda today. So yes, the Obama phenomenon, I think, reflects the same alienation of the population that you find in polls which say every large 80% say the country is run by a few big interests. Well, Obama says we're going to change that. There's no indication what the change is going to be. In fact, the financial institutions, which are his major contributors, think he's fine. So no indication of any change. But if you say change, people will grasp. You say change and hope, people will grasp and say, okay, maybe this is the savior who will bring about what we want, even though there's no evidence for it. So I think the Obama phenomenon and the alienation go hand in hand.
Would you see any difference, let's say, between a McCain administration
I think so.
or Obama administration?
Well, McCain is another example of the very effective propaganda and creation of imagery. I mean, if suppose there was some Russian pilot who was bombing civilian targets in Afghanistan and was shot down and tortured by the American-run Islamic fanatic terrorists there, would we say he's a war hero? Would we say he has he's an expert in strategic and security issues because he was a bomber bombing civilian targets? No, we wouldn't. But that's the image that's been created of McCain. His heroism and his expertise in strategy comes from the fact that he was bombing people from 30,000 feet and shot down. Not nice that he was tortured. Too bad. Shouldn't happen. Crime and so on. But it doesn't make you a war hero or a specialist in foreign policy. That's all public relations creation. I mean, the public relations industry is a huge industry, very sophisticated. I mean, probably something like a sixth of gross domestic product goes into marketing, advertising, marketing techniques, and so on. And that's a core element of society. That's the way you keep people separated from one another, subdued, focused on something else, and explicit. As I say, it's all discussed in the public relations propaganda.
Sure. But going back to the question is, would you see any difference in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah, I think McCain is maybe worse than Bush. He doesn't say much because you're not supposed to say much about issues, but the few things he's had said are pretty frightening. He could be a real loose cannon. That might explain the sympathy that Europe has towards Obama as a way of sort of stopping. Well, I think that, Europe, actually the American establishment itself was afraid of Bush. Bush came under unprecedented criticism from right in the mainstream. For example, when his national security strategy was announced in September 2002, calling for preventive war, virtually announcing a war in Iraq, immediately, within weeks, there was a major article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, condemning what they called the new imperial grand strategy, and not on principled grounds, just that it would be harmful to the United States. And right through, there's been a lot of criticism. And the Bush administration, it's a very narrow spectrum of policy, but they're way at the extreme, if not off the extreme, of radical nationalism, extremist radical nationalism. And McCain is probably in the same territory. Obama very likely would move back to the center-right, where the Clinton administration was. It's called the Democratic Leadership Council. It's sort of a center-right grouping, not extreme, more pragmatic in its dealings with people. Actually, the Bush doctrine itself is an interesting example. The so-called Bush doctrine of preventive war, brazen contempt for even allies and so on. The doctrine itself was not new. Actually, Clinton's doctrine was even worse taken literally. The Clinton's doctrine officially was that the United States has the right to use force to protect access to markets and resources. I mean, that's more extreme than Bush. But they presented it politely, quietly, not in a way that would alienate even allies, so the Europeans could pretend they didn't hear it, you know. Of course they knew it, and in fact probably approved of it, the European leaders. But the Bush doctrine, the arrogance and brazenness and extremism and ultra-nationalism of the Bush administration, that did offend the center, the mainstream center, and Europe. So yes, they'd like to see someone more polite following the same policies.
Now, do you see room for the left in the United States at some point, and how that would come up?
I think this country ought to be an organizer's paradise. I mean, if you look at public opinion, which is very well studied, it's remarkable. So, I mean, on the issues where you've done the main work, on health program, I don't talk about it. If we had a functioning democracy, the United States would have had a national health care system decades ago. The public's always wanted it. The same is true in foreign policy. I mean, take, say, Iran, you know, the next big issue coming along. The public has every presidential candidate, including Obama, says we must maintain the threat of force against Iran, keep the options open. It happens to be in violation of the UN Charter, but this is an outlaw state, so nobody comments on that. But not the public. A large majority of the public says we should not have threats, we should enter into diplomacy. The public holds that large majority, like 75%, that Iran has the rights of any signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the right to enrich uranium for nuclear power, but not nuclear weapons. And strikingly, a very large majority of the public thinks that we should support a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, including Iran, Israel, American forces deployed there, and so on. That happens to be Iranian official policy. And in fact, the United States is committed to it if you look formally at what it signed. But no candidate could even mention this possibility. If the United States were a functioning democracy in which public opinion influenced policy, this issue would probably be settled. Many others too. Take, say, Cuba. I mean, for 45 years, the United States has been dedicated to punish Cubans. We have the internal documents from Kennedy and so on. You got to punish the Cuban people because of what they called the successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. The Monroe Doctrine established the U.S. right to run the hemisphere. The Cubans are successfully defying that. Therefore, the population must be punished by a very substantial war, terrorist war. Wasn't concealed. Arthur Schlesinger, the official biographer virtually of Robert Kennedy, describes Kennedy, and he was a Kennedy advisor himself, says that Robert Kennedy was put in charge of bringing the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That was his prime responsibility. They were fanatic about it. And an economic strangulation in order to punish the population for this misdeed and so on. But what does the public think? I mean, polls have been taken since the 1970s. About 2/3 of the public says we should enter into normal diplomatic relations with Cuba. It's just the way the rest of the world does. But the extremist fanaticism of the establishment, that includes the whole spectrum here, Kennedy is the one who started it, won't hear of it, and no political candidate will ever mention it. And the same is true on a host of issues. So, as I say, it should be an organizer's paradise. I think the possibilities for the left are extraordinary. And that's one of the reasons for the clamping down on opinion, on expression of attitudes, and so on. And in fact, it is a pretty activist population. So if you, there are more people involved in activism on one or another serious issue today than in the 1960s. It's just kind of subdued. And there are many popular movements now which never existed in the past. I mean, take, say, the solidarity movements with the Third World. That's something totally new in the history of European imperialism. And it came from mainstream America in the 1980s. There were rural churches, evangelicals, right from the mainstream. Thousands of people were going to Central America to live with the victims of Reagan's terrorist wars, to help them, to try to protect them. Maybe a white face will protect them, and so on. And there's just thousands or tens of thousands of people. Actually, one of my daughters is still there in Nicaragua. But this never happened in the history of imperialism. I mean, nobody from France went to live in an Algerian village to help to protect them from, French atrocities. It wasn't even an option. Nobody considered it. Mm-hmm. But in the 1980s, it developed spontaneously, not in the elite centers. So you didn't find it in Boston, but you did find it in rural Kansas and Arizona. And it's now spread all over the world. So you have Christian peacekeepers in Hebron, in other words, or the global justice movement that developed here, what's called ridiculously anti-globalization. The propaganda says that it began in Seattle. It didn't begin in Seattle, it began in the Third World. But if hundreds of thousands of Indian peasants storm the parliament, that's not a fact. If some people do something in a northern city, that's a fact. So the mass popular movements in Brazil and India and so on, they didn't exist until a northern city became involved. But it did become involved. And it's now spread over much of the north as well as all over the south.
And speaking about this, in terms of the anti-globalization movement, has been a splendid movement, but at the same time there's a feeling that maybe it's stuck. And in that respect, what do you think about the idea of establishing a fifth international or some form of organization that could come up with an alternative to the current order and system?
Well, I've talked at the meetings of the World Social Forum, which are always in the South, and I've mentioned that. I said, it seems to me that this might be the seeds of a real international, and in my view, the first international. I mean, what was called the First International was important, but it was very localized. It was parts of Europe, and it was essentially destroyed by Marx when he couldn't control it. The Second International collapsed before the Second World War. The Third International was taken over as a propaganda institution by the Soviet Union, and the Fourth International was marginal Trotskyite. But this is the first authentic international, or at least the seeds of it. Not just the World Social Forum, but take, say, the Via Campesina. Last time I went to Porto Alegre in Brazil to go to the World Social Forum, the first place I went was to the international meeting of the Via Campesina, the International Peasants Organization. Very lively, very exciting. This represents most of the population of the world, and it was really exciting to be there. The World Social Forum as well. I mean, this is authentic globalization. These are people from all over the world, all parts of life, interacting, discussing, and going back and trying to implement ideas about social change. I think it'll fail. It's too early, but its failure will raise the level of action for the next try. So I think it makes sense what you say, that it is maybe the seeds of the first authentic international, constituted of popular classes from all over, and trying to overcome the extraordinary alienation that's felt everywhere, right in the United States and elsewhere, feeling that the institutions don't work for us, they work for someone else, for themselves. Perception which is accurate. And if that can coalesce and be organized and move to use the freedom that we do enjoy, that's a very significant prospect.
One thing that in Europe is very worrisome is the Americanization of the European politics, which I assume that is happening everywhere. And even the left has lost its language. For example, even left-wing leaders do not speak about working class. They speak about middle class. Class struggle has completely disappeared, things like that. So there is a very worrisome development where the American language is now appearing in Europe And that goes side by side with the enormous weakness of the left. That Americanization seems to be paradoxical, because at the same time United States influence is going downhill. Here you see Europe that is becoming more and more American in terms of the politics. Political parties have lost its potency and value, rather than political parties, particularly left-wing parties, became sort of personalities with media networks, and politics became a show, a theatrical show, as you said at the very beginning. Slogans came up without any meaning. How do you explain that at the time that America is declining, the United States is declining, the cultural and political values and meaning of the United States establishment is becoming very dominant?
Well, that's a large topic, but just to sort of pick a few elements of it. If you look over a longer historical sweep, Europe was the most savage and brutal region of the world for centuries. Establishing the nation-state system in Europe was a program of mass murder and destruction. I mean, the 17th century, probably 40% of the population of Germany was wiped out in a war. In the course of this savagery and brutality, Europe created a kind of a culture of savagery and even a technology of savagery which enabled it to conquer the world. I mean, like England is a little island off the coast of Europe, but it dominated the world. And the rest of Europe didn't have exactly nice policies. A small country like Belgium was able to kill probably 10 million people in the Congo. Well, this of course was associated with racist arrogance of the most extreme kind. I mean, it finally culminated in the two world wars, the Second World War. Since the Second World War, Europe has been at peace, not because Europeans became pacifists, but because there was a realization that the next time they play the traditional game of slaughtering each other, they'll wipe out the world. They've created such a culture of savagery and a technology of destruction that that game is over. Well, since in the Second World War also was a sharp shift of global power. The United States had been the most powerful economy in the world for a long time, far more than Europe, but it was not a major player in world affairs. It dominated the Western Hemisphere. There were some forays into the Pacific, but it was second to England and even France. Second World War changed all of that. The United States ended the rest of the world was seriously harmed or destroyed. The United States profited enormously from the war. The war ended the Depression. New Deal didn't. Industrial production practically quadrupled. The United States ended the war with literally half the wealth of the world, incomparable security and military force, and planners knew it. They planned for global domination, in which exercise of sovereignty by others would not be tolerated. The plans are interesting, and they were implemented. Europe, at the end of the war, there was a real wave of radical democracy, anti-fascism, the resistance, workers' control. Some of it was quite significant. And the first task of the United States and Britain, the conquerors, was to crush it. So in country after country, Japan as well, the first task of the liberators, so-called, was to crush the resistance to fascism and to restore the traditional order, maybe not under this, even with many of the same leaders, in fact. And it was a battle. It didn't happen overnight. So, for example, in Italy, Italy was probably the main target of CIA subversion, at least into the 1970s, when the record runs dry, to try to prevent Italian democracy, because it'd be a big role for the labor movement, which they couldn't tolerate. It gradually sank in. European elites accepted a position in which the United States would take over their traditional role of running the world by savagery and barbarism, and they would accept the gains that come from global domination. And there was it's not that the radical Democrats lost. I mean, Europe did gain a measure of social democracy. In fact, Europeans live better than Americans in many respects. They're healthier, they're taller, they have more leisure. The United States has especially since the 1970s, has the highest work hours in the industrial world, about the lowest wages, the worst benefits, the worst health outcomes. Even just height. If an American goes to Europe, first thing that strikes you, how tall everybody is. And it's literally true, in fact. So Europe has had many gains from this subordinate position. Let the United States take the lead in invading, destroying, massacring, and so on. And a kind of a complacency has set in which it's almost a sigh of relief after centuries of savagery and barbarism. We'll relax and follow somebody else, let them do it, and we'll just enjoy life. And this has, in the political classes, business classes and so on, they don't have any objection to this. What you call Americanization is really the spread of business control. So yes, business classes are quite happy. They're closely integrated with, there's some conflict, but really closely integrated with U.S. industry. I mean, if you look at the conflicts, they're interesting. So we're supposed to have the ideology says we have a free market. In fact, we have state-based economic systems. The dynamism of the high-tech economy comes from the state sector, places like where we're sitting right now. And then it's handed over to private capital to exploit. And sometimes it becomes almost comical. So maybe the leading export, or one of the leading exports, is civilian aircraft. Civilian aircraft is now dominated by two companies, Airbus and Boeing. And they're constantly having battles in the World Trade Organization as to which one gets greater state subsidies. And in fact, they're both offshoots of state power. In the United States, an offshoot of the Air Force and aerospace. It wouldn't exist without it. In Europe, it's massive state subsidies. And when they finally, recently there was a great horror in the United States expressed over the fact that Airbus won a contract to refuel Air Force for planes to refuel for the U.S. Air Force for refueling. Well, you take a look at the contract; it's integrated. It's a U.S. company working together with Airbus. Sure. That's what we call a free market. Sure. State-based industries which are integrated with one another. Sure. But for the European business classes and the American business classes, this is an acceptable arrangement. And since they largely dominate the societies, okay, that's what the propaganda and the doctrine says too. Sure. I suspect that right underneath the surface, a class struggle still exists and is understood and is ready to burst out at any moment. It's true you're not supposed to talk about it. Yeah. So one of my daughters teaches in a state college that's relatively poor students whose aspirations are to be a nurse or a policeman or something like that, for the most part. In her first class, she asks them to identify themselves, their class background. Class is a funny word, most of them never heard it, but because you're not supposed to use that word. But the answers that she gets are either underclass or middle class. If your father has a job as a janitor somewhere, you're middle class. If your father's in jail, you're underclass. Those are the two classes, you know. Well, you know, that's an ideological triumph. Mm-hmm. The idea that class has something to do with who gives the orders and who follows them, that's been driven out of consciousness, at least on the surface. It's there right below. And as soon as you talk to working class people, they know it perfectly well.
Sure. No, I had promised not to abuse you, and I know that you are very busy, but I want to thank you. Just last question, a very personal one. And I really mean it. A lot of people in the world thank you so much for the work you do. But where do you get your strength? How do you move on? Because you are here in the center of the empire, speaking quite clearly to that powerful forces, and in that respect, being silent, being bitter, being marginalized, and meanwhile, all over the world, people read you, admire you, find your work extremely helpful.
See, I don't feel marginalized in the United States. When I go home tonight, I'll spend 5 hours answering email, and probably several dozen letters will be invitations.
I mean by the power structure.
I don't care about the power structure. I mean, that's not where I live. You know, if I wasn't their enemy, I'd think something's wrong. So that's why I have that picture of the magazine cover prominently displayed. I'm doing the right thing. So it's partly that, but it's partly things that are illustrated by some of those photographs over there. The one over there is the worst labor massacre probably in history in Chile a century ago. It was in Iquique. The mine owners are mostly British. These are miners who were, I've been there. The mines are indescribable, but they marched about 30 kilometers to the town to ask for a slight increase in wages. The mine owners welcomed them. They brought them into a schoolyard, allowed them to have their meeting, and then brought in the soldiers and machine gun them all. Nobody knows how many were killed. You don't count the number of people you were killed, like maybe thousands. It's a century before there was any commemoration of this. That's a small monument, which I saw last year, that was put up by people, young people, who are just beginning to break out of the iron grip of the dictatorship. And it's not just Pinochet. Chile has a bitter history of state violence and repression. But now they're breaking out. So yes, the atrocity took place, and now we can begin to pay attention to it. That one over there is given, you'll know what it is, of course. It's a painting given to me by a Jesuit priest. Archbishop Romero was assassinated in 1980. 6 leading intellectuals, Jesuit priests, had their brains blown out by US-run terrorist forces, the angel of death standing over them. That captures Reagan, not the cheerful uncle, but that's the reality of the 1980s. I just put it there to remind myself of the real world, but it's been an interesting Rorschach test. From people from the United States, almost no one knows what it is, because we're responsible for the massacres, so therefore we don't know. From Europe, maybe 10% of people know what it is. From South America, almost everyone knows what it is. Until recently, young people don't know, because they too are having history driven out of their heads. History and reality is too dangerous. On the other hand, they're coming back. So the Iquique monument is young people rising up, wanting to recover the past and recover the idealism and do something about it. So that's enough to keep, more than enough to keep anybody going.
No, thank you so much. It has been great, and you have a standing invitation to come to Barcelona, and on behalf of millions of people, thank you so much. Thank you. Good. Coincidireu que ha sigut una entrevista molt interessant. 45 minuts d'una veu crítica. Seria important que veiéssim la rellevància que el que Noam ha dit té pel nostre país. Com deia al principi, parla del futur, i aquest futur no funciona si el model és Estats Units. Una de les coses que ha dit, que crec que és important subratllar, és que una cosa és la llibertat d'expressió, que tothom pugui dir el que vulgui, i una altra és la democràcia, en el sentit de que aquest que es digui té que tindre accés als altres. Des d'aquest punt de vista, el problema més gran que té la democràcia als Estats Units, entre altres, és el gran control dels mitjans d'informació, dirigits, manipulats per grans grups econòmics i que canalitzen què és el que arriba a la gent o no. I des d'aquest punt de vista hi ha un enorme control del missatge, de la informació als Estats Units, que la persona més coneguda fora dels Estats Units no apareix mai en els grans mitjans de comunicació. Això és un tema d'una enorme rellevància i que, en certa manera, ja passa també en el nostre país. Veus d'esquerra no surten molt freqüentment en els mitjans de comunicació, catalans i espanyols, i certs missatges estan clarament discriminats. Per exemple, com és que no hi ha més articles crítics de la monarquia en el nostre país? Com jo li pregunto a Noam Chomsky, és estrany, perquè sembla que als Estats Units és una estructura tan sòlida que l'establishment es tindria que sentir molt segur i permetre's el luxe de tindre més diversitat. La mateixa pregunta es podia fer aquí a Espanya i a Catalunya. Com és que no hi ha veus antimonàrquiques en els mitjans? Si la monarquia és tan sòlida, està tan establerta, podríem permetre legitimar-la amb una diversitat més gran de veus crítiques. I en canvi no surten veus. I el que diu Noam Chomsky és veritat, perquè l'establishment està molt menys segur del que nosaltres ens creiem que està. I això és molt important. És molt important que aquest enorme control dels mitjans és perquè la gent que té el poder no està segura. I com passa als Estats Units, la gent normal i corrent del carrer és molt més progressista que no l'establishment desitja que sigui, i per aquest enorme control d'aquesta informació. L'altre punt que fa és sobre el fenomen Obama. El que estem veient als Estats Units és pràcticament la desaparició de la política i la substitució per uns missatges mediàtics que se centren molt en personalitats i les seves característiques. Si un té més experiència, si l'altre desitja més canvi, però sense, per exemple, en el cas de canvi, quin canvi s'està demanant? A través de quins instruments? Paradoxicament, el candidat del canvi està apoyat per alguns grups financers més importants dels Estats Units que són responsables dels problemes que existeixen, com per exemple en la sanitat. Aleshores, aquesta imatge de símbols, de missatges mediàtics, avui el poble dels Estats Units no sap ben bé què vol dir aquest canvi, excepte que ja està tip del que té. I des d'aquest punt de vista, això també és important, aquest missatge, que la política es desapareix substituïda per missatges mediàtics de tipus personal en xarxes mediàtiques que no tenen valor en quant a explicar la realitat i encara menys en quant a presentar alternatives. Això no vol dir que tots aquests personatges siguin iguals, representen interessos diferents. I des d'aquest punt de vista, ell, naturalment, valora més la possibilitat que surti l'Obama que no McCain, que McCain seria ja l'ultradreta. Però és important, no tant per lo que Obama és o diu, sinó perquè hi ha avui, als Estats Units, una sensació d'alienació, de descontent, de moviment anti-establishment, com també apareix en Europa. Recordem el que va passar en la Constitució Europea, recordem en el que en diuen les enquestes, l'increment de l'abstenció, la distància entre els representats i el representant s'està fent més i més gran. I això és el que ell parla. Aleshores, si aquest moviment anti-establishment es canalitza, pot inclús desbordar a la persona que d'una manera mediàtica apareixia com a missatge de canvi. El Roosevelt no era una persona molt progressista, però el fet de que havia en aquell moment un sentit de canvi va fer que el va forçar. Va ser la gent la que va forçar. No va ser el que va liderar el canvi, sinó que va forçar a que Roosevelt establís el New Deal, que és les bases de l'estat de benestar d'aquell país. L'estat de benestar en els Estats Units és molt deficient. I des d'aquest punt de vista, aquesta demanda, per exemple, per la universalització de la sanitat, de polítiques de plena ocupació, de salaris més altes, aquesta pressió és el punt clau que porta a la importància de l'organització, que és l'últim punt que crec que és molt rellevant per a nosaltres. Quan ell subratlla tant que l'organització és clau. Des d'aquest punt de vista, ell és optimista en quant als Estats Units, perquè creu que la gent, la classe treballadora, les classes populars, que quasi mai apareixen en aquesta situació, excepte que en les últimes eleccions es va redescobrir la classe treballadora, quan un negre per un costat i una dona per un altre eren plenament conscients de que guanyarien o no depenguessin que poguessin mobilitzar aquesta classe treballadora que havia inclús desaparegut del discurs polític. Això és molt rellevant aquí en el nostre país, en què quasi ningú, cap dirigent parla de la classe treballadora ni de la lluita de classes. Doncs això és el que està passant als Estats Units, i en Chomsky ho parla en tota claretat. Des d'aquest punt de vista també parla d'Europa, en què Europa no pot ser un apèndix dels Estats Units. La funció del govern federal dels Estats Units a Europa ha sigut enfeblir a les esquerres. Parla del cas d'Itàlia, podria parlar també del cas d'Espanya. Aleshores, Europa, sobretot l'Europa d'esquerres, es té que distanciar, independitzar d'aquest tutelatge de l'establishment dels Estats Units i el seu govern federal. I per últim, parlant del món, ell creu que el món té grans possibilitats, que hi ha un moviment antiglobalització que té que organitzar-se. I des del punt de vista acaba ell demanant una nova internacional, molt crític dels internacionals anteriors, i creu que s'ha d'organitzar un esquema en el que coordini, relacioni aquest moviment del qual ell creu que té un enorme potencial. Moltes gràcies.